Here's a well-known speech. Now, I know you can't read the words too well. That's okay. I'm going to read it out loud to you, and some of you can see it better than others. It doesn't matter if you follow along or just listen. This is from a book about interpreting the Bible, and it's a discussion by a scholar named Allison, is his last name, not Greg Allison, about illusions and oral memories. And to make the point, he starts off by giving some examples from the famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. As he says here, Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech greatly enlarges its meaning through tacit references to famous predecessors. It opens with 50 years ago, right? A manifest allusion to Abraham Lincoln's first words in his Gettysburg Address. There follows numerous examples of unacknowledged but obvious borrowing, among which are the following. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. And that's a clear echo of now is the winter of our discontent, may glorious summer by the son of York, from the beginning of Shakespeare's play Richard III. Where does the next one? Yeah. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Right? As he says, it draws on Amos 5:24. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Clearly, there's a quotation from the Declaration of Independence, but also before you get to the quote, it's sort of prefaced. Right? He's already alluding to the Declaration of Independence before he quotes it. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places shall be made plain, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. That's from Isaiah 40. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. And as Allison points out, it takes up the language of the old Protestant hymn, My Country 'Tis of Thee. So, and he goes on to talk about what he's doing. And what Martin Luther King Jr. does in that speech is he takes quotes and allusions from some well-known, some not as well-known pieces of literature, brings them forward and recontextualizes them in a new setting so that they still, of course, contain their old context, but now they have a new context. They're being read in a new way. So now when you read that speech, and whether you're aware of it or not, you're reading his reading of older texts. And then when his speech gets quoted maybe later down the road by somebody, what you have then is this sort of perpetuating of a particular kind of reading of texts. And that's an example of how inter and intratextuality works. It's really just an idea of how texts read themselves perpetually. And there's a lot of examples. We'll talk about lots of different things. But to get a handle on this, it's not really ideal at all just to hear some principles or to just see it done. And that's what we're going to do. We'll look at a few examples and see how texts spill into other texts, how an earlier text is read inside the Bible and then read again, how a tradition of reading sort of flows through. It's no good just to be sort of talked to about it. The only way to really grasp the way that texts are read inside the Bible is to know the Bible in such detail and depth that it's almost as if you were pricked, it would flow out of you. And that's the way you have to think about the New Testament writers. Now, Obviously, they are inspired by the Holy Spirit, clearly. And that is going to make and have a huge influence on sort of readings of the Old Testament and the content of the Old Testament's there and any number of other things like that. I'm taking that as a presupposition and a given. On the other hand, think about this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Right? That's the preamble to the Constitution. Whether you realize it or not, and we're conscious of it and also unconscious of it, we who were born here, when we think about things like rights, and we think about what's right and wrong, and we think about what we should be allowed to do, and we think about how cultures and societies work, whether we know it or not, we are greatly, greatly, greatly shaped by sort of a national consciousness that is informed by those foundational documents of our nation. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does this make sense? Maybe we can quote pieces here and there. I can quote that because when I was a kid, there was this thing called Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday mornings. And that was one of the things that rolled every week between like Bugs Bunny and whatever else would be this. And so I learned adverbs and nouns and all kinds of other stuff, but I also learned the preamble of the Constitution. And it stuck with me. Why did it stick with me? Because it was repeated over and over and over and over again at a formative time in my life. Now, whether that's true of you or not, still, things like manifest destiny and all kinds of things, and ideas like certain inalienable rights. I mean, we think about rights in certain ways as Americans because it's been bred into us. And we have certain expectations because as Americans we have this sort of national consciousness. Now some of you may be sitting there thinking about, oh, it's all fragmented now and it's this and that, but that's not what I'm talking about. We have a collective sort of mind in a way. And it's based on, to a large degree, not only, but it's to a large degree, it's based on these founding principles and documents that were so important at the founding of this country. Right? The Declaration, obviously, the Constitution, all these sort of things are going on. And of course, there's more to it than that. Now, given the impact of that, now imagine that you live in a culture and you live in a society where every single year, at different times of the year, you sat down at a dinner or a festival or something, and your parents, your father, repeated the history of your nation to you over and over and over again. Or frequently you went to the capital city, and as you walked up to the Capitol, as you walk up to the Capitol, the certain texts were repeated over and over and over and over and over and over again. And any number of contexts that you're in, texts are read, you're reminded of traditions, so much so that these things become sort of the warp and woof of your very existence. Right? The history of Israel, the covenant, the law, the Psalms, so that you're soaked in them as a culture, as a society. Well, now, of course, there's lots of things we could say. Well, they've been in exile. Some people knew it better than others. Sure, fine, whatever, great. That's true. But the fact of the matter is the Old Testament was the shaping, formational agent in the life of Israelites. Right? No matter how much differences there may be in interpretation, no matter how many other things have flowed through historically, in a way that it's difficult for us to understand, in a way it's difficult for us to grasp. And so, rightly, to be able to hear and grasp the influence and the use and the reading of the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have to try to, as best as we can, soak ourselves in the Old Testament. Or in the Bible, not just in the Old Testament, but in the Bible. So that it becomes so deep down rooted in us that it flows out of us. Now, one good way to do this is to start working on memorizing the Bible. There's a pretty well-known pastor down in North Carolina, and he has things like Deuteronomy memorized. Or Romans, Ephesians, Matthew, or one or two of the Gospels. Now, he did it, but he's really good at it, and he just decided instead of doing some things, everything in life is a decision, right? You decide to either do this or that. And he decided, instead of doing whatever else, he's going to do this. And he's really good at it. He's got a really good mind for it. But one of the things that's true, when you talk to him or listen to him preach, whether he is totally conscious of it all the time or not, it is flowing out of him. And that's kind of the way we need to think of these issues of how does the New Testament read the Old Testament? How does the Old Testament appear in the New Testament? It appears in a way that is, I'm not saying it's subliminal or anything like that, but it appears organically, naturally, because the Old Testament is flowing right into it. Now, there's various ways that texts are used or show up in the Old Testament. Obviously the easiest one is just a direct quotation, right? All you got to see are quotation marks, or italics, or whatever. Those are pretty easy to spot. Though, the use of it might not be that easy to determine. Right? So even though it's easy to spot a quote, understanding why that quote is there at a particular time may not be so easy. But nevertheless, you can see a quote pretty easy. You can have something like an explicit reference where there's not really a quote, and maybe Galatians 4, like Sarah and Hagar. There's an example of a reference. There's no quote there, but there's obviously, clearly, there's a reference. Now, you can also have something called an allusion. And that is when a writer alludes to another text. And here's basically a definition of it. When one text shares enough with another text, even without reproducing several consecutive words from it. Even without reproducing several consecutive words from it. That is, a text isn't quoted verbatim or explicitly, but it's still there. Now, these can sometimes be tough to identify because there's not, in general, the same sort of concern we have for precision in quoting is not always shared by speakers and writers in the New Testament. Not only that, they didn't really use quotation marks like we do. And not only that, when they quote from the Septuagint, there were different versions of the Septuagint than the version that we typically the version that we typically use, which of course is made up of versions. And sometimes they quote from memory, it seems. And there's lots of discussion about how often texts show up in other texts. So for instance, one scholar has identified, in his mind, he says, he's identified more than 100 Old Testament quotes and allusions in Romans 9 through 11 alone. Now, that's debatable. That's debatable. But nevertheless, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It can be, and you might think, well, is there 100 or not? Well, it depends. I'm not saying there is or there isn't at this point. All I'm saying is, when you start, the further you get away from explicit quote and reference, the more difficult it can be to say for certain, aha. But remember, you have to keep in the back of your mind, that background is always there. Always. There's never a time where it's not there. Now, the New Testament goes beyond it, right? The New Testament is not bound explicitly, like it's not chained, it's not bound by the Old Testament. It is new revelation. I'm taking all that for granted. Okay? Here's some examples. And some of these are expanded upon or taken from examples by Moises Silva, an excellent New Testament scholar. Now here's a good one. And this comes up at your front door often, or should, when people come to visit you that you didn't invite, but they're there. Philippians 2, 5 through 11, in that context says that Christ will be exalted, right? And every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Well, that's an allusion. It's nearly a quote in a way, but it's at least an allusion to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 23. Now, I think more is being alluded to, though, than just the simple knee bowing and tongue confessing. I think in the context of Philippians 2, 5 to 10, that the Isaiah quote or the Isaiah allusion from chapter 45, it's not just the quote or the verse that it alludes to, it's the context. And the context becomes extraordinarily important for understanding what it is that Paul is saying in Philippians chapter 2. It's extremely informative. Isaiah 45 is a text that's concerned about asserting the oneness of God. And it flows right on the heels of Isaiah 44, which is a text all about idolatry, which I read the other day. And so then you come to Isaiah 45, and you have a text that is, again, the big concern is to show and to claim and proclaim the oneness and uniqueness of God and God alone. There is one God, right? And if you want to broaden it out something, if you want to broaden it out contextually, you have things like, I am God, there is no other. My glory I will not share with another. Right? But coming back specifically to Isaiah 45, who is it? Before whom will every knee bow and tongue confess? It is Yahweh. Clear, flat out, Yahweh. Now, Paul, in a text about the person and work of Jesus, Paul, who knows the Old Testament, chooses a text to apply to Jesus from a context that is all about how there is one God and one God alone. And he uses it and applies it to Jesus. So, Philippians 2, sometimes we back away from that because we get a little iffy because we can get pressed on, we'll sometimes get pressed either by the modern day Arians who come to your door, or you can be in engagement with people from other religious traditions. But the fact of the matter is what they miss, because they're thinking, they'll read these things about he didn't think equality with God is something to be grasped. Well, that's a different issue, but they'll push us on that and we'll kind of cave in a little bit. When in fact, grasped is the wrong word. This is an aside, but he didn't think equality with God is something to be exploited or something to be used or exploited for his own gain. That's the idea. Grasped has nothing to do with it. Not the way we use the modern English word grasped. It has nothing to do with understood or something to be sort of hang on to. So anyway, that's aside. But then sometimes we will back off because we don't see that the allusion to Isaiah 45 is the anchor to that whole text to show that Jesus is divine. Otherwise, it is inexplicable why Paul would use, there's many texts in the Old Testament, why he would choose one that is clearly an assertion of the unity and oneness and uniqueness of Yahweh. Why he would choose that text and not mean to show that Jesus is divine is inexplicable. Right? So there's an idea of where there's more than meets the eye. You read across that and you think, yes, everybody's going to worship Jesus. Well, it's not just simply everybody's going to worship Jesus. Everybody's going to worship Jesus exactly the way the Old Testament says everybody's going to worship Yahweh. And Yahweh is not a God that is known to be desiring to share His glory with other gods, even ones of His own creation, so-called. Okay? Well, let's get another one. This came up in class the other day. Matthew 27. My God, why have you forsaken me? Right? He clearly quotes Psalm 22:1. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's just look at a little bit of it together. All right. Here we go. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh, my God, I cry by day, and you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. Yet you are holy, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted, and they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried, and were delivered. In you they trusted, and were not disappointed. Here's a pattern we've seen quite a bit this week. What's being asserted right off the bat? God's track record of faithfulness in the past. Right? I mean, how many times have we seen this? In so many contexts. Right? So you have, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then immediately calling to mind and also bringing before God God's own faithfulness in the past. But I am a worm and not a man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate with their lip and wag their heads, saying, commit yourself to the Lord. Let Him deliver him. Let Him rescue him, because He delights in him. Yet you are He who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from my birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. And then he goes on to say, don't be far from me. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as a ravening lion. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen. You answer me. And of course, it goes on from there. Well, I think that in my view, it's pretty clear that the cry from the cross is a tip of an iceberg of the context of Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 does not end with a note of despair. It ends with a note of hope. Now, I'm not going to complain. Sometimes people will say, this can't be pointing fully towards the cross because His bones were not broken. I don't understand how that means this can't be pointing towards the cross. I mean, I don't think it's a one-to-one sort of all these things have to be happening exactly. The story in Psalm 22, 11 through 18 is all about what? The suffering that's being undergone. And yeah, some things are really clear, but the fact that it says, I can't find it. All my bones are out of joint. And then it's pointed out that none of His bones were broken. I don't think that all of a sudden means the context is not in view. Again, it's not a one-to-one analogy, and I don't know why it needs to be a one-to-one analogy. Especially when the overwhelming content of this context points so dramatically towards the suffering of Jesus on the cross. And that's a relatively easy one. Now, you asked a question about Psalm 22 the other day. Is that in line with what you were asking? Was there a follow-up question?
Well, actually, I was just kind of asking you that question to kind of see where you stood on the whole, is it a cry of victory or a cry of dereliction?
It's both. Yeah. See, again, the question is it a cry of dereliction or a cry of victory? I think it's both. It's a cry of dereliction that does not see. It's a cry of dereliction that is not the end of all things. It's not the final word. But it is. It's not simply. I think we need to be careful. I'm not saying I don't know what you're saying about it, but we need to be careful that we don't make it just a cry of victory and somehow lessen the intensity of the suffering of Christ on the cross, as he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" And again, I think it can be both. I understand exactly what you're asking, and to some people that sounds a little bit wishy-washy, but the context of Psalm 22 is both. It's extreme, untold suffering that is bookended by words of faith and hope, right? And so this fits, this fits this pattern of biblical faith and conduct that we've been talking about many times, and that is, in the midst of all this suffering, there's a recollection of God's faithfulness in the past, and then a confidence of God's deliverance in the future. But that doesn't, in that sense, lessen the suffering in the middle or make it go away. But what it does is it defines it by something else, something larger. Does that satisfy your question? Good. I was glad you asked that because I knew we were going to come back to this very text. Let's consider one or two more. Here's an allusion. We've talked about this on the first day in the big picture, and it's come back many times. The idea of the suffering servant in the New Testament. Not near so many quotes of the suffering servant as there are allusions to it in the way Christ describes himself, and then also what you see him suffer and go through on behalf of the people. But the fact that there's not a lot of quotes about it has caused many people, including evangelicals, especially those sort of influenced in the 60s through the 80s, to say things like that, like, you show me the quotes of the suffering servant in the New Testament, and I'll agree with you. Well, I think this is an example. This is a great example of how the quotes don't have to be there to see the pattern of suffering in the life and ministry of Jesus, and then how it's described, both by Jesus and by the apostles. When Jesus says he came not to be served, but to serve, Mark 10:45, I think that that's a pretty clear allusion to the suffering servant. And not only that, I mean, Isaiah 53 appears enough times from quotes in the New Testament to anchor it, and then you see so many similar themes and allusions virtually all over the whole book. Now, of course, as I've said, the surprising thing is you have the suffering Son of Man connected to the triumphant reigning and ruling, the suffering servant connected to the triumphant reigning and ruling Son of Man from Daniel 7. And so it's not surprising to me, even though the statement Son of Man is not immediately evident, because it has more than one referent. Somebody in the first century could hear this phrase Son of Man and not necessarily jump on board with one specific idea because it was vague enough. But the fact that Jesus is referring to Daniel chapter 7, I think, is manifest in the way that he talks about the kingdom continually in, say, Mark. And so when he chooses the title Son of Man for himself, in the midst of saying like coming in the clouds, in the midst of saying the kingdom is coming, the kingdom is here, it's arrived, repent and believe the gospel, I think that's what helps us see that Daniel 7 context is all over the Gospels. But again, it's not always because there's a specific quote. Well, there are other places. There's the idea that people often talk about of echoes, and that's similar to an illusion. The only problem is an echo is even harder to discern than an illusion. And this idea of echoes, I think this is where it gets down to the things that I started with a minute ago, and that is where you see, I think where we were discussing, sorry, I misspoke, where we were discussing the way the Old Testament is the sort of the fabric of their existence. At the same time, we have to be really cautious because people can hear echoes really when it's hard to say that there's an echo there. I think in a more general way, it's fair to say that the Old Testament is echoing all over the New Testament, but we have to be careful that we don't then zoom in on one line or one clause or one phrase that happens to have some overlap and say, aha, you see, there it is exactly. The problem is sometimes people want to move over from what appears to be kind of an echo of an Old Testament and all of a sudden narrow it down to virtually a quote. And so it's difficult. It can be very, very difficult to identify echoes. And at the same time, I want to say this. As important as the Old Testament context is, we can't let that overshadow the context of the New Testament. Because those Old Testament quotes and allusions, when they are put in the New Testament, they have a new context. Just like when, as I've said, just like when Jeremiah is a book, a prophetic book, it's placed in the context of the canon, it has a new context. So when Jeremiah is quoted in the New Testament, those quotes have a new context that's not simply bound by its old context. It's more than it. It's more than the old context. The cry of dereliction from Psalm 22:1, the cry from the cross in Matthew, it's not bound by Psalm 22. It has a new context. The context is now the cross of Jesus, right? Which is another reason why it doesn't have to be bound to be a one-to-one correspondence between all the things that happen, like the bones being out of joint. I fail to see why, given the fact that this is not just artillery shot from the Old Testament up to the New Testament. And it's not just here's what we were talking about, by the way. It's the fulfillment which always supersedes, which always expands and supersedes the original promise, right? Because the word that is given in the Old Testament and then fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament could not be contained just in the one quote or whatever from Psalm 22. It turns out to be so much more. And so, again, we have to be careful that we don't, practically speaking, subordinate the New Testament to the Old Testament. Just say to yourself over and over again, the New Testament is new. It's new revelation. It's not just the code. It's not just the code book for the Old Testament. Well, let's look at some examples of how texts are read inside the Bible. We'll start with Philippians chapter 4. Philippians 4:18. But I have received everything in full and have an abundance. I am amply supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you have sent, a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Okay. What does the language of that verse sound like to you? What does it call to mind? It's pretty explicit. Yeah, fragrant aroma, acceptable sacrifice. Exodus 29:18. I think this is right. And you shall offer up and smoke the whole ram on the altar. It is a burnt offering to the Lord. It is a soothing aroma and offered by fire to the Lord. Pretty clear. Right? That Paul is alluding back to Old Testament imagery of the sacrifices and applying it to the gifts, the Philippians have supplied him with. Right? And it wafts up as an acceptable service. Well, I think that Paul is doing more than just reflecting back on Exodus. I think at least the case can be made that he's reading it via Ezekiel 20:41, where Ezekiel has done something similar. As a soothing aroma, I will accept you when I bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you're scattered, and I will prove myself holy among you in the sight of the nations. There you have the nation of Israel being accepted by God in the same sort of language as it talks about a sacrifice being accepted towards God. And so this idea that here, of course, it's a sacrifice. It goes up. It's pleasing to God, acceptable to God. That language is taken and applied there to Israel, and the same language flows up, and Paul applies it then to the Philippians. Now, this does not in any way exhaust sacrificial language. But this idea of taking this idea of taking the sacrificial language and applying it to something that's being done in and for God's people, and here by God's people as they're empowered to do it, there's already precedent for reading it that way inside the Bible. That's all I'm trying to say. All right, here's another one. We won't do too many. You get the point. James, hold it, 4:2. I'll just jump right in the middle. So you commit murder. Right here he's talking about the way they're treating one another, right? It amounts to murder. All right. Don't overthink it. When you think of murder being something that's prohibited, where does your mind go? Yeah, Exodus 20:13. Now, and it wouldn't be surprising either, isn't it? Because James has a lot to say about the royal law of love and about what it means to say you're going to keep the law. Now, clearly, this is homicide, right? Am I wrong or right about that? I think I'm right. That this is homicide. I don't think that James is saying to the people he's writing to, is there something wrong with commit? Man, this is on DVD too. Like, well, he can't spell, but I don't know. Anyway, who cares? I can't. It's fine. I think it's unlikely that James is saying, hey, in your community there, you really need to ease off on the homicides. It's just not working. It's just, it's really not Christian. It's a bad witness. So you got to stop, right? Stop bludgeoning one another to death when you come together for church. It's probably an obstacle towards your worship. It's unlikely, and of course I'm speaking in an incredibly silly way about it. What James, I think, is doing, James is applying Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5:21 to a real life situation. You know that biting and devouring of one another? You know what you're doing? You're murdering each other. So again, you could say, well, it's just metaphorical. Okay, fine. Yeah, it is metaphorical. And I think James, though, is getting his idea. This is serious. It's not just a, come on, ease up on one another. You're really just too mean. You guys are just too mean. It's serious business, what he's saying to them. They're violating. This is why Jesus says, okay, you've heard it said you won't commit murder. But I tell you, anybody who says, you fool, hates his brother, has committed murder. And so again, remember, just because we're in the new covenant, that doesn't mean, again, let's just take it easy, and it's okay if we sin, because ultimately it's forgiven anyway. Right? And that's sometimes practically the way we act. We act like in the new covenant you can sin with a high hand because there's been ultimate final forgiveness. But that's never the view of the New Testament. Now, what the view of the New Testament, of course, is things like this will be means that cause the people of God to hear the Word of God and respond to it and then persevere. But not just persevere because they made some mistake. They made some decision in the past, right? They're meant to hear this and then respond to it. It's a means of sanctification. It's a means in their life to keep them and preserve them. That's how commands work, right? That's how warnings work, right? And again, so it's neither is it the case of, well, it's pretty up in the air, you guys might lose your salvation. It's not that. At the same time, it's don't presume. Don't make presumptions and then presume that you can live any way you want, right? Because I think from James to Paul to Peter to the writer of the Hebrews, biggest example, one of the biggest examples, the idea is that Christians will hear things like this and will act accordingly. And by that means will show themselves to be the true people of God. Right? Not like robots. And certainly not like people who just made a decision and agreed to a certain thing, a certain list of truths in the past. And that's good enough. Okay. Well, there's some others we could do, but I don't want to... you get the idea. I think what you'll find upon careful study is there's a lot more of this in the Bible than maybe we think it is now. Having said all that, the big danger to this is that it becomes an exercise in cleverness. And that's interesting. And more than one person has been kind of taken up with these kind of things, but really it just becomes a matter of trying to find interesting connections. But we're never called just to be interesting. It's good to be interesting. But if we're reading the Bible just to find clever and interesting connections, we're reading for the wrong motivations, right? I don't normally say this kind of thing, but when it comes to these sorts of things, especially because you can see now when we get into this sort of realm of hermeneutics, we're really getting into the realm where there's a lot of room for discussion and give and take and sort of, I need to see exactly why it is you're saying that. Show me from the Bible. There's a lot of room for discussion, a lot more room for questions, and we need to be careful that we don't just get caught up and never ask the question, so what? So what? That's a neat connection you just made. But if it's got to be more than neat and interesting and clever. Right? You can't preach a sermon just full of clever, interesting stuff. It feels good, right? When people walk out saying, man, I never saw that before. And that can be good. But if that's simply all it is, I don't really know what all has been accomplished. Right? So, if you want, there's again, as I've said all along, and now I'll say it and double it, there's not a particular sort of method that you're applying or laying down on the text to see this. how do you make and try to see and try to show these connections? Well, you just have to know the text really, really well. But the good news is this. All you have to do is want to do it. All you need is the desire to do it. That's it. You have the gifts. You have the ability. You certainly have the tools. I do too. And now all we have to do is merge that together with a desire to do it. Okay? And obviously there's more to it than that. But that's really the starting point. Okay, why don't we just take a short breather, and we come back and we'll talk a little more about the Old Testament, New Testament use of the Old, and then we'll wrap things up.